The ruins of the Yuan Mingyuan are for the Chinese a reminder of a painful period in the history of their nation. The 19th century, with its cultural weakness, its opium, and its attacks by foreign powers. The enormous and beautiful complex was utterly destroyed in 1860 by Anglo-French troops during the Second Opium War, one of the low points in the history of the Qin dynasty, the last to sit on the Dragon Throne, and the same Manchu dynasty that had erected that monumental residence in the 18th century for its own pleasure and to impress the European diplomats. The Italian-style labyrinth of the great complex has recently been restored. The other Western-style building designed by the Jesuit Giuseppe Castiglione for the Manchu Qianlong Emperor are still under restoration. I think they will never be restored. For the entire 19th century and for a part of the 20th, the West regarded China as a giant turned in onto itself, not only unwarlike, but effeminate, with its silks and its eunuchs, refractory to the masculine scientific, industrial, and military modernity of the Westerners, paralyzed by corrupt officials and ruled by incompetent sovereigns, a land ripe for territorial, economic, and cultural conquest. This was an image of the celestial kingdom quite different from the one entertained by the European contemporaries of Brother Castiglione and by their 16th and 17th century predecessors. After Marco Polo and what many call the romance of the Grand Khan, in the Occidental imagination, the immense nation had become not only the source of marvelous products such as porcelain, silk, and ginger, but an idealized land, governed by wise emperors and safely removed from centrifugal European barbarism. Even the skeptic Michel de Montaigne was able to write, quote, "In China, the organization of the government and the arts has nothing in common with ours, but is far better. People present themselves to justice not only to exculpate themselves, but also to be rewarded. Justice does not only punish, but also gratifies." Later, thanks to the Jesuit missionaries, the information coming from the immense Middle Kingdom became progressively more specific, especially as preparation for more effective methods of evangelizing. Also, in the unsettling eventuality of the collapse of the Ming Dynasty and the invasion of the northern Qin. However, among the motivations that impelled travelers, merchants, and missionaries toward their far-off destination, there were also the influence of a kind of a literature that, as we have seen in the case of Montaigne, lent to China and its emperors an air of wonderment, even of fable. I must emphasize that to supplement the lucubrations of Montaigne or others and to instruct 18th century Italians on the China of the Qin and on Manchu customs, there were also the writings of Father Athanasius Kircher and Father Martino Martini. Martini's description of the conquest of China by the Qin dynasty as a frontispiece bearing the image of a Manchu horseman who looks not so much as a Tartar, but more of a Turk, or even a soldier in those Balkan armies that fought against both the Ottomans and the Protestants. As trophies, he carried severe heads with Turkish-looking hairstyles. In other plates of the same Jesuit book, we find details inspired by Italian art. I say this to emphasize how Castiglione's equestrian and military pictures function almost like snapshots of Manchu China, wisely ruled by the Qianlong Emperor. In this respect, they are comparable to the 19th century photographs of John Thompson or Felice Beato. They are genuine visual testimonies, copied directly from material reality of Qin China, where Brother Giuseppe operated. This is evident in the scroll entitled Ma Chang Smites the Enemy Ranks. The pictures serve as a visual equivalent of the words of Qianlong, with which the emperor praises a hero of the punitive expeditions against the Dzungar tribes. Ma Chang is shown galloping on a white steed, clutching a quiver as he prepares to strike down an enemy who is already pierced with 2 arrows. The face of the heroic captain and the weapons and costumes of the 2 antagonists are efficacious elements in a genuine visual narrative. In this sense, Castiglione works marks a definitive break with earlier fantasies. In this sense, we suppose that Castiglione was familiar with previous work, such as Martini's plays, but he chose to improve on the realism of the image. With the appearance in the West of an increasingly militant art, among the critical problems of modernity, we find that of the relation between artist and political power. To believe in a man wielding supreme power and to place oneself in his service has been a commitment and a wager for many European artists from the time of Napoleon onwards. I find the case of Castiglione particularly interesting, precisely because he had to deal with this question ahead of time and on the other side of the world. As a Jesuit, he owed allegiance to the Pope in Rome. Yet to perform his role as a missionary artist, he was induced to embrace the standard of a frightening pagan prince, a sovereign who seemed to him to be just, and at whose court he might perform his task of service in authentic fashion. Such loyalty towards an Oriental emperor characterized the adult life of Giuseppe Castiglione and caused him a crisis of identity, or so I should suppose. On the other hand, some of his paintings attracted the sincere compliments of the Qianlong Emperor. Impressed by the foreign missionary representational skills, it was Qianlong himself who, at the residence Yuanmingyuan, had a pavilion built called the Scepter of Gudo. There, next to the apartments of the royal princes and beside a room reserved for the private audiences of the emperor himself, Castiglione worked every day together with Chinese and European artists. We know from contemporary Jesuit sources that Qianlong had since his boyhood been an admirer of Brother Castiglione, and that because of his respect for his old friend's moral and artistic qualities, the emperor awarded him important commissions and even appointed him a mandarin of the 3rd class. The close relationship between the Italian Jesuit and the Chinese emperor continues to exert a fascination in our own day, when cultural barriers and religious differences tend to circumscribe, if not to restrict, authentic relations between persons of different ethnic origin. But Castiglione was well aware of these differences. He sought to overcome them through his faith in Christ, acting on that scintilla of spirituality that renders similar the men of every latitude, despite the generalized violence, the suspicions, and the atavistic fear felt by the Chinese of those who came from far-off lands, especially if they came to preach a new religion. Yet the West, where Castiglione had been born, was not only violent, but was deeply divided both religiously and politically. Even within Catholic countries, there were warring divisions and a progressively secular mentality was eroding the cultural dominance of the Church and in particular of the Society of Jesus. Thanks to their thorough humanistic training, the Jesuits had managed to carry beyond the bounds of Christendom not only Catholicism, but the best of Western culture and professionalism. During the first phase of the mission to China, the creativity of the Jesuits and their writings had been of an essentially religious character. Then Matteo Ricci, Limato, realized that in order to attract the ruling classes and the imperial court, it was necessary to bring into play areas of knowledge unconnected with the apostolate. Useful technical subjects such as mathematics, astronomy, and geography, very much in response to the interest and request of the Chinese. By assimilating the intellectualist Confucian costumes and abandoning the esoteric Buddhist ones, it was possible to convey certain ideas to the Mandarins, though the missionary success was limited. As Father Nicolas Standard wrote, quote, "The Jesuits hoped to convert the emperor and his entourage, as they sometimes converted court women and eunuchs. But their presence in court circles was dictated largely by practical concerns. That is, it enabled them to avoid being seen as heterodox on a local level. And it was acquired only through compromise. Very often there was a subtle interplay between the missionaries and the emperor, in which each side took advantage of the other for its own purposes." End of quote. Thus, Western knowledge and skills came to appear useful for the empire's scientific technological improvement. Before and during Jesuit influence, practical studies returned into favor, thanks also to the new pragmatism of thinkers and officials of the Donlin Academy. When Castiglione first arrived in the China of the Kanshi Emperor in 1715, he was required to play a specific role, because this was what was requested by the subject of the mission, that is, the emperor himself. Later, because of his friendship with the Qianlong emperor, the situation changed. Consider the words of the secular priest Matteo Ripa on Kanshi's request to the new arrivals Castiglione and the physician Jesuit brother Giovanni da Costa. The two Jesuit brothers arrived here the 21st, and so His Majesty, who on the 22nd saw a dog painted by Brother Giuseppe Castiglione and liked it, and also saw some instruments and metal works by Brother Giovanni Giuseppe da Costa. They came well supplied with books and with instruments for their activity. When the painter was asked, the painter is Castiglione, when the painter was asked if he could paint figures, and that he also knew a few other things, he said he could do portraits and perspective. In fact, the emperor taught that those he called the Christian apostles should confine themselves to the mathematical sciences, or in Castiglione's case, to perspective and portrait paintings. In China, Castiglione played the humble but useful Jesuit role of temporal coadjutor brother, fratello coadjutore in Italian. That is from December 8, 1721. His artistic talents were employed by the Society of Jesus as the Father General in Rome taught feet, so that Brother Giuseppe's efforts might bear fruit. Like numerous other novices in the 17th and 18th century, he had asked his superiors that he might offer his existence to the society as missionaries to the Indies. Devotion to St. Francis Xavier, admiration of Matteo Ricci's labors to bring the Chinese to Christ. And the beguiling reports emerging from Eastern Asia were the motivating influences on many young Catholics, together with a desire both for self-sacrifice and for adventure. To travel for thousands of miles and to go and live in the Far East, as Castiglione did, was a genuine test for the strength of one religious convictions at the other side of the world, truly a different place, with another thinking and another morality. Quite apart from the linguistic challenge, it was a testing on the characters of the missionaries, engaged as they were in a dialogue with cultures, in the case of China, the Han and the Manchu, whose costumes and conventions were alien to the European Christians. From the method of measuring time to the complexity of the ideograms, from the symbolic significance of clothing and hairstyles to the food that was to be consumed in specific situations, from relations between the sexes to the appreciation of physical beauty, and more important than any of this, a different notion of transcendence. Since Brother Giuseppe spent half a century in the China of the Qing emperors without once returning to Europe, we can easily imagine the strength of his commitment and devotion to the Catholic faith. It was, however, a time of grievous difficulties and sufferings for the Chinese Christian community. So it is likely that Castiglione in Beijing also suffered moments of terrible isolation, the conditions that Jesuits call spiritual desolation. This is a moment or phase undergone by many sensitive souls, during which only the most sincere motivation is able to compensate for the sufferings and illusions with a spirit of authentic discernment and self-analysis. In his studios at the Chinese court, lonely amongst the pupils and the eunuchs, lonely among the dignitaries, and perhaps even amongst his fellow religious, Castiglione would have prayed that he might become an efficient instrument in God's hands. In accordance with the teaching of Ignazio de Loyola, he would continuously have taken the steps necessary to overcome his sense of desolation. Prayer for the gift of divine grace, prayer to the Holy Spirit, self-examination, the eliciting of perfect contrition, the interiorizing of the deepest possible resolution to resist evil. The activity of the artist as missionary, and together with that, work the struggle against the evil that settles upon men in times of especial trouble, must in any case have been revised by Giuseppe himself and by his superiors, even those in Rome, so as to perfect his own activities as a temporal coadjutor brother, and to evaluate whether his being a co-painter raised the standing of the Jesuits and of the Christians in general, hoping always for better relations with the court of Beijing and with the Chinese, with whom he worked shoulder to shoulder in the service of the Manchu emperor. Faith and religious life were not to be dissipated in intellectualistic speculations, nor to be rendered obnoxious to his Manchu hosts, but were to express themselves authentically in prayer, in total devotion to the cause, in impassioned conversation with others, that is, in action of kind of a frontier caritas, being located at the frontier of personal capacities, through which the activities of the humblest missionary, in this case a temporal coadjutor, not a priest, working actively as a painter, might reflect and glorify the innermost nature of Christianity. In this respect, even his friendship with the Qianlong emperor brought him both happiness and bitterness. He well knew that their friendship was based on the emperor's approval of his artistic talent and of his intelligent willingness to adopt certain Chinese aesthetic and cultural elements. According to the author of a Memoria Postuma on Castiglione, a Jesuit who well knew Qianlong's opinion of the Italian artist, there was no better definition of his painting than that expressed by the emperor. For Qianlong, Giuseppe's brush was, quote, capable not only of imitating the natural reality, but of recreating it. To better understand the efforts made by Castiglione and the other Jesuit artists to meet Qianlong's wishes by achieving an intermediate style between East and West, we might cite some words written by Father Jean-Joseph de Grammont. He was describing the Pekingese activity of the Italian painter brother Giuseppe Pansi and comparing him to his fellow Jesuit Castiglione a short time after the latter's death. We are in November 1773. De Grammont says of Brother Pansi, as far as his artistic talent goes, I should say straight away to your reference that he is far too good for this country. He therefore finds it out to adapt himself to the genius of these people in the same way as the excellent Castiglione and Attiré found it out. End of quote. According to de Grammont, the major problem was that of shadowing. Quote, Father Poirot and these other painters of ours who paint without rules, learn from the masters, without understanding the art of chiaroscuro, shadowing, and which, however, is the very soul of painting, are able, with less difficulty, indeed with great facility, to adapt themselves to the style of the Chinese, in whose eyes the shadows in a picture are just dirty stains. End of quote. Castiglione also, before the time of Pansi, de Grammont says, had been obliged to adapt himself to the local taste. Quote, but your reverence may rest assured that the two aforesaid, Britton, Castiglione and Attiré, after all their efforts were finally, after some time, highly esteemed and appreciated by the emperor, and so shall our Pansi be. End of quote. The comparison with Castiglione, 7 years after the latter's demise, held good for Qianlong, especially for portraits. Quote, because of these shadows, the portrait Pansi painted 3 days after his arrival in Beijing of the emperor did not please, although it was a good likeness. This year he painted a vision of Prophet Daniel, which was highly admired, whence it is to be hoped that with the Lord's help his brush will be no less useful to our mission than was that of the celebrated Castiglione, his fellow countryman. The emperor also passed a moral judgment on Brother Giuseppe, as is also recorded by the author of a Memoria Postuma on Giuseppe Castiglione, a posthumous memory. And this Jesuit, anonymous Jesuit, most probably a German, commented on Qianlong's ability, quote, to discern the vices and virtues of men, and on his high opinion of the rectitude of Brother Castiglione, whose equal he thought could not be found in all the world. End of quote. The emperor discerned certain human qualities in Giuseppe. This suggests to me that the temporal coadjutor was not lacking in conversational ability and a certain rhetorical power, which Qianlong might have associated with a particular philosophical disposition, the mental and almost ethical effort to combine the Western with the Chinese aesthetic, in the version that the Manchu emperor himself had made his own. As had been emphasized by scholar Wu Zhu, in the case of the European-style buildings of the Yuanmingyuan Park, Qianlong had commissioned their design to Castiglione himself, and not to his fellow Jesuit Ferdinando Moggi of Florence, although it was Moggi who was known even to Qianlong for his architectural abilities, because of the emperor's admiration for the poetical qualities of Castiglione's paintings. It was these poetical qualities, or rather suggestions, that were to be transposed into the theatrical settings of the innovative and exotic pavilions. The ability to speak to Qianlong, necessitating a certain fluency in spoken Chinese and perhaps in Manchu, must have been a great help to Castiglione. This was something that Panzi, years later, was quite unable to manage. Brother Panzi was in fact highly insecure in his role as court painter. Quote, "I'm very poor in the love of God. I advance in years, but I make no progress in this holy love, being dissipated with my painting and filled with vanity. Every day I have to go to the palace to work. Often the emperor comes to see us, and we always have to receive him on our knees, and not to get up again until he has left. The Chinese language is for me a great anguish, not being able with my poor memory to speak." I'm very sympathetic with Brother Panzi, because I have a Chinese wife and I don't speak a word. So that, going back to Panzi, so that in China I cut the same figure as though I were deaf and dumb. End of quote. Only his great faith kept him going. Quote, "None of this matters. Let it be all for the love of God, resolving that with the help of divine grace and through the intercession of Mary Most Holy, I might serve this holy mission for the rest of my life, please God, with the same sentiments and with the good will that I had when I entered the Society of Jesus. For my own part, I will do everything possible not to be expelled from China." Castiglione, however, came up against the bitter reality of Qianlong's hostile attitude to Christianity. Despite all his efforts, the results were the same, if not worse, than they had been under the earlier Qin emperors. He realized that in speaking to Qianlong, who frequently came to visit him, he was not allowed to touch on matters of Christian beliefs unless specifically requested to do so by the emperor. And even when requested, he was always to be courteous and never boring, always friendly and never boastful of Catholic glories. And he was to answer the emperor's questions in philosophical and not in theological terms. Undoubtedly, Brother Giuseppe hoped that also through his own effort, the Jesuit mission to Beijing might regain the favor that had been shown to the Society of Jesus by Kanshi, the grandfather of Qianlong. However, despite his personal successes in Beijing and the honors he received, I think that Castiglione must often felt himself suspended in a vacuum, living under the protection of the court while other Christians in China risked imprisonment. He knew that as an imitator Christi, his life was indissolubly linked to the activities of his fellow religious and of a multitude of Chinese Christians, especially since international politics outside and inside of China presented itself as an infernal labyrinth of vested interests contrary to the divine word that the Jesuits wished to introduce into the celestial kingdom, also through their own version of inculturation. On several occasions, 1736, 1737, and again in 1746, Castiglione sought to alleviate the condition of the Chinese Christians and of certain missionaries facing death execution, violating court etiquette by directly petitioning Qianlong during the emperor's customary visits to his study. I wonder if Castiglione did not consider himself to be of less importance than Andrea Pozzo, the lay brother Jesuit artist whose disciple he proclaimed himself to be. In the contest of art in the service of the Society of Jesus, it is plausible that Giuseppe compared his own court portraits and his pictures of horses and pagan warriors to the sacred inventions of Pozzo, works that in Rome or in Vienna celebrated the success of heroic Jesuits in converting so many non-European peoples.